This breakout session is about collaborating with the right skills at the right time. And I want to introduce Doug Saylors. For those that you don't know Doug, he's one of the most senior cybersecurity directors there at ISG and is a thought leader in the space on how to partner with your providers. So he'll give a lot of the perspectives from what they're seeing in the market and how companies are adapting to this new world and working with their the right relationships when it comes to security operations. And as we go through this, the second part, we'll break it into kind of the dilemma, which looks at what, as we move to a much more agile, security-focused world, how do we decide whether it's better to insource or outsource this, or maybe there are better models and ways? And then we'll look at some of the models that are using and how these are shaking out, and we'll add in our commentary from CyberProof. So anyway, Doug, welcome.
Thanks, Tony.
Okay. So I think what we'll do is first part of this, I'll hand off to you, and you can just let me know when to change the slides. But the first section is around insource outsource dilemma. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So so the first slide I want to talk about, and I'm going to be speaking about insource versus outsource from a purely security perspective today. I do a lot of large transformational deals that have security as a component. We also see a lot of deals in the market today that are strictly focused on security. I'm generally going to be speaking about those security deals today. I think I'd like to open by saying, from a market perspective, we see organizations that are all over the place from a maturity perspective. People, process, technology adoption, and scalability, very different based on company size, geography, industry, et cetera. And it's a real differentiator in the security space, because if you think about infrastructure, that has been predominantly commoditized over the last 5 to 10 years. Pretty much all major companies look the same. I think the biggest outlier there might be cloud adoption. We see more and more companies moving to cloud, but there's still I think a segmentation there. But we generally don't see that for things like infrastructure. It's very different in the security space, though. And we have a view that there are basically 6 attributes that you should look for and consider as you're looking at insource versus outsource. And things that you shouldn't compromise on. So the first one is cost efficiency, and we'll talk about this on a later slide. Generally people perceive insourcing from a security operations center and up to the middle and maybe the top end of the security stack as being more efficient, insourced rather than outsourced. We don't see that actually being true in the marketplace. We think there's a real difference of capability you get from an outsourced provider. And so when you're comparing insource to outsource cost, we see a lot of apples to orange comparisons, right? And that's something that we think companies need to take a strategic look at what they're outsourcing and considering as part of that SOC or their security stack to make sure that you're getting an accurate comparison. The other thing that we see quite a difference in is access to specialist skills. There's a view that you can do it better in-house. What we're seeing in the market is access to L2 and L3 security skills. It's getting harder and harder to find people with those skill levels that you need to be truly effective at things like threat hunting, as an example. And those are also skills, or investigative support. Those are skills that you don't need on staff 24/7. And we're seeing more and more of those kinds of activities be sourced in a different manner. And we'll talk about that a little bit from a pricing perspective as well. From a communications perspective, clearly on an insource model, everyone works for you. You're going to get better communication with your security organization if it's internally, but we don't see it as a significant differentiator. The providers have become much more adept at communicating globally. The work from home model has definitely increased capability in that space for both in-house and sourced models. But it's another area that you should put some focus on as you're looking at sourcing models, but it's not something that's insurmountable. And we believe that you can overcome any barriers there from a source perspective for certain components of the security stack. The other places, though, that we see a little bit better, I guess, delivery or capability, clearly knowledge of business. You're going to have higher knowledge of your business if those resources are insourced and work for your company. There are certain things, though, that we think you should retain: investigations and other things like that I mentioned a minute ago. Those kinds of things require intimate knowledge of your business. The other thing we would say, though, is it depends on the industry you're in, right? So the business risk models differ significantly across industry. Financial services versus manufacturing, as an example. Risk tolerance is different. Risk models are different. You have different compliance and regulatory requirements that you have to deal with. In some of those more highly regulated industries, it makes sense to have a retained organization. However, there are still functions that you can source. The other thing that we see as a real differentiator across those industries is the attack surface. Entities that have large numbers of IoT devices out there, as an example, have significantly higher attack surfaces than insurance companies in the financial or BFSI sector. So those are the kinds of things we see people evaluating. Again, we think you should take a strategic view, to what part of the stack you should source. We'll talk a little bit about kind of what we see from a market perspective, how people have modified their sourcing approach. Control, clearly, if everyone's on staff for you, you have more control. At least there's a perception you do. From a team alignment perspective, I think generally there's a view in the market that you get closer alignment if you have everybody on staff, they all work together. However, what we're seeing from a real market delivery perspective is that's not actually true, right? People are spread all over the place. It's really hard to get L2 and certainly L3 resources that are going to move anywhere these days, right? I mean, the skill sets are in such demand. People are really focused on working from where they want to work, and work from home has exacerbated that. We do think in a hybrid sourcing model, you get a much better team alignment than you do if you're looking to outsource the full security stack. We'll talk about that on a later slide as well. But one of the things that we've seen from a market perspective is people maybe went too far in dealing with their MSSPs on their first sourcing approach or attempt, and we're starting to see some changes there as well. Tony, if we go to the next slide. And sorry, if someone could let me know if there's any questions as we go. I can't see the pop-ups for this while I'm in presentation mode. From an ISG perspective, we think there are 7 basic characteristics that you should look for when talking about what you're going to source and looking at MSSPs. The first one is they need to be experts in cloud native technology stacks. If you go back 3 or 4 years ago, I would not have made that statement. Today, this is table stakes. We don't see any security providers out in the market that are succeeding that don't know cloud inside and out. And the reason is business is going digital and it's all moving to the cloud, right? So if you're talking to MSSPs today and they can't tell you the difference or how they're going to manage security across AWS or Azure, just 2 very easy examples, probably suggest you look elsewhere. The second key principle for us is you should be applying agile principles to cybersecurity. I was talking to Tony last week about this. From our perspective, you need to move at the speed of market or faster. You hear speed to market from a product side. On the cyber side, you need to be moving at market speed or faster to stay in front of adversaries. The third primary principle for us is you need to be heavily leveraging machine learning as part of your cybersecurity program, and your partners should have capability there that they bring as part of their solutions. There's just no way with the threat vectors that are out there today and the continual evolution in that space that you can keep up with it with a pure labor focus driven model. One of the challenges that we've seen in some deals that have been out there for 4 or 5 years is they were structured as just a traditional outsourcing contract. They had static SLAs, they had no provisions for adopting new technology, and it was a labor-based model. There's just no way to keep that moving and keep your maturity level evolving the way that you need to. The fourth bullet for us, partnering with academia and government. The primary reason that we're calling that out is there is some bleeding edge technology that's coming out of academics. There's bleeding edge technology that governmental entities have had to adopt because of the APT threats that are out there. We think to be successful, you're going to have to partner with those kinds of organizations to keep your products up to where you need to go and evolve and stay aligned to the threats that are coming out. The fifth bullet for us, sorry, I'm just looking at the time, embracing a hybrid staffing model. Not everyone out there in the market is good at everything. Managed security services providers are no different. There are some people out there that will tell you they can do everything. They'll do a full stack security program for you. In reality, behind the scenes, they're out there competing for the same kinds of resources that you are, and they're putting their focus on where the broadest demand is from their customer base, which might not necessarily be the best thing for you. So we think a hybrid model is the way to go. We'll talk in just a minute about commercial models. There are some real differentiators here, I think, in the security space. And the last one is focusing on reducing your risk over increasing security. This is a real challenge in the marketplace today. We see a lot of demand where people want to shift accountability for security rather than focusing on how they can reduce risk and risk of loss as part of a partnership with their provider rather than just shifting it. Tony, if we go to the next slide. So I want to talk just briefly about cost of running a SOC internally versus externally. This is data from a Ponemon Institute piece of research. A couple key things I'll point out. First of all, these are average values across industries of multiple sizes, but you can see just quickly the insource versus outsource. Outsource looks to be approximately 50% more expensive. This is the apples and oranges phenomenon I mentioned earlier. What we see when we go in and look at outsourced SOCs is people have really oversized the scope of what they're looking to outsource in the security space on day one. This goes back, 3 or 4 years where, again, people were looking to shift accountability as a result of some really large breaches and other things that were out there. You'll see that 63% of organizations are looking to bring SOC operations back in-house. 2 drivers there. Again, scope is too big, and then stale technology. Some of those older contracts, people were focused on, making it look like an infrastructure deal, static service levels, no way to advance capability over time. They didn't have good analytics built into those solutions. And they're having staffing concerns with those older contracts that are body-based, right? You just can't keep up from that perspective. On the left-hand side, the key thing I would point out here is it takes nearly 8 months to get a SOC analyst, onboard them, and make them productive. That's an extremely long amount of time. The advantage of outsourcing is they have large pools of resources they can bring to bear, and they have technology, right, that can move you up that maturity curve quickly if you pick the right provider. Again, the other thing I mentioned, and we'll talk about on the next slide, is you need an agile framework to deal with the issues that you find in traditional sourcing models. So Tony, if we can move there. So I think the key here is not everyone looks the same in this model. And if you look at the traditional sourcing model, there were standardized operating and commercial models. They weren't agile, they weren't flexible, they did not allow for agility. They also didn't support multiple partners, especially in the security space. Again, it goes back to the single stack provider for everything. They were SLA driven rather than KPI driven. That is not something that we advocate today. Certainly you need a couple of SLAs around basic availability. But the primary driver for that approach seems to be that we've always done it that way, right? And people weren't really open to new contracting mechanisms. My view on this particular topic is, do you really want a service level credit from your security provider? No, you don't, right? And so that's an outdated way of thinking. We need to move past that. It should be focusing on business outcomes, ways to mitigate reputational damage, and focused on minimizing risk of loss over time, right? Constantly improving that security posture. A couple of other points on this slide. Absence of incident handling support in traditional outsourcing models, this is a real concern. One of the things that we see from a market perspective is contracts that are more than 2 or 3 years old tend to treat a security incident like any other incident. It might be a priority one, but it's going to follow that standard ITIL process. We're firm believers that you need to have certified incident handlers available to handle incident security procedures or security incidents, and you need to be able to branch appropriately once something is identified as a security incident. And then the last bullet on the right, visibility into provider operations. You need to have a platform. Tony's going to talk a little bit about their platform. One of the things that we're seeing today is you need the ability to aggregate across multiple types of solutions and get single pane of glass and analytics to go along with that. And that's something that we also don't see in traditional models. Sorry, Tony, I'm trying to speed up so we can get to your stuff. If we go to the next slide, and I'll wrap up here and take questions or we can move into Tony's. Again, the keys for us is you need to have agility, you need to have different contracting models, and if you're doing an internal versus external comparison, you need to really take a hard look at what's included and that external cost that you're most likely not doing in your internal operations.
Doug, I appreciate that. This is a great overview, and as you know, we saw a very good strategic alignment as we worked together on some of the proposals that ISG ran. So so one of the things when looking at this idea, one of the key concepts that we've seen in the market is this hybrid engagement model. But one of the challenges with a hybrid engagement model, it's not always an easy thing to enable, right? There are contractual reasons that are hard, but there's also just people, process, and technology challenges in the process between working together between a customer and a service provider. From a people perspective, it's a shared resource model. And Doug, you mentioned that, there's a perception that it's easier if you own all the people. But one of the challenges in that model is, how do we collaborate effectively? How do we draw on the strengths of the different parts of the organization? We'll go into that in a little bit. but more importantly, how do we, when we talk about collaboration, particularly in the sense of a security operation, where we may be doing things like incident response, how do we bring the right talent to the right problems at the right time? And how do we force that collaboration, which is very, very important and really requires more of a platform approach. The second area is process, as we all know. And one of the key aspects of security in general is how do we make, as we go from more of a controls-based approach where we look 2 years out and we decide what technologies we're going to buy and develop a roadmap, and we have, we try and work down the controls map, to what I call more of a security operations approach, which has to be more agile. What's happening tomorrow? What kind of threats are we seeing? How do we adapt to those threats? And become agile. How do we make security operations a little more centric as part of the security organization itself? And then as part of that, what many of our customers have asked us for is, how do we be more transparent in terms of the performance? So this is back to what Doug mentioned. How do we move from maybe SLAs and credits to, let's look at our key goals and objectives, and how do we align and how are we performing against those objectives around risk? And then frankly, it is extremely important. There's some great new industry frameworks. We'll talk a little bit about MITRE and how we can use that to help us be a little more agile and dynamic and understand the threats and how we bring that together. And then finally, technology. One of the biggest challenges I see is how do we make the best of the old technology, get it implemented and working, but how do we also keep an eye on the new stuff? And I think the technology market is moving so fast, and when you buy things, they become obsolete very quickly. So how do you manage this from a perception? What am I spending money on? Am I getting value for it? And how do we pull it all together? So it needs a much more dynamic, agile model of looking at what some customers have asked us for is kind of a technology portfolio analysis. Let's look at what's actually performing for me. Let's look at it on a risk basis, and then tie that together with what I should purchase and what I should retire. The next, one of the key challenges when you get into this is security is changing so quickly, and how do we connect what I call the bottom of the organization, the technologies that are looking and working on the SOC and the architecture every single day to protect the company, and how do we communicate the value back up to the board of director level? And we spent a fair bit of time understanding the board conversation. And, there was probably a perception that risk needs to be put into dollars terms, meaning I have to say, how much cyber risk am I preventing? But in fact, what we found, the board conversation is a little different. They pick up the newspaper in the morning, they see that one of their competitors had a certain type of attack. Maybe it's ransomware where their systems went down, or a data breach. So the questions are more related, what is our risk to this type of attack? What have we done to mitigate that? Are we spending the right amount of money to do that? And when we can put the conversation into that context, and the board will understand, and the boards today are getting more and more interested in how they need to address and how they should pay attention to that, because they're a personal risk today, not just the companies at risk. So the way we analyze that conversation, let me kind of start in the middle, because we said, let me start at the top. We need to understand for every business, what are their top loss events. So if you look like an insurance provider and you wanted to insure something, one of the key ones for many businesses, say you're in manufacturing, is maybe my system's being down for a long time and I'm not able to serve my customers. So how long can those systems be down? What's my acceptable loss? And what's my target response window to mitigate the damage in those types of scenarios? And these are the types of questions that you would ask the CISO, but more and more you're seeing the head of SOC get involved, because you want to understand the target window and what we can do to detect it faster and respond to that faster. And in many cases, when you can bring the expertise of a service provider in as well, then we can align the goals at this level. The next is really around security delivery. How are we protecting against those attack scenarios? So these loss events would have multiple ways attackers could enable those events to happen. How do we analyze those events, understand how well we're protected against those events? But most good security people know it's not if, but when. So when the attack happens, how can we detect it and how can we respond faster? MITRE gives us an amazing framework today to be able to understand the different attack techniques, map them into kill chains, and to be able to understand, what kind of gaps do I have in my detection capabilities, and if I can detect it fast enough, am I prepared to respond to that? So when you have this framework with you, you can start looking at how we have improved, how much have we reduced the gaps in my detection, what's important, how have I lined that back up. And as you know, as we get more and more of these detection scenarios, you get more false positives, you get more data. You have to balance that out with risk. So you need to really understand which of these loss events are more important, so we can balance out the workload. And then finally, this breaks down into what are my preventive controls, what technology roadmaps do I need to put in place, what detection rules do I need to build, what response times do I need to work, and have I built the right playbooks, and have I automated the right things? And we're seeing really a shift in our market to let's look at security a little more like disaster recovery. So how do we architect these things to be faster and make sure we have all the proper processes in place? And these are areas that can be worked very closely by bringing the expertise of the provider together with the customer. So let's look at kind of the operating model. Where does this hybrid approach come together with the customer and the provider? And what you'll see here is, the security operation is where you get into incident response, and there's a couple of key boxes you'll see in yellow that are ripe targets for being more hybrid. The first is this: under this security monitoring and detection area, you would generally have a level 1 team, which is triaging events. And this is where most MSSPs provide service. Many times it's a black box, meaning events are coming in and alerts are coming out the other end, but there's not a lot of transparency of what happens inside that box with that team. Now, so there's a couple things that need to happen. We need more transparency, but we need that level 2 and that level 3 area to work together. And the reason you'll find for that is level 2 and level 3 require a good knowledge of the architecture, the internal network environment. They need access. They need to know who to talk to in certain scenarios. But from the other perspective, it's very, very hard, unless you're a top tier financial services firm, to bring top security talent, people that, for example, have deep expertise in malware reverse engineering, or they know different type of attackers and techniques. You have threat intelligence, these sorts of people, and to bring them into the analysis. So this combination of bringing service providers who can do a better job of bringing that top tier security talent together with the people that have knowledge of the business provide a great opportunity for the hybrid model. The other area is really this whole incident response and digital. So as you're responding to incidents and you need forensic skills, these skills are not needed, first of all the time. You need them upon an incident, but this is also an area that you can work together closely with your provider to provide that. There's an opportunity, I call it, there's kind of a pre-breach and post-breach opportunity. So how do we, when after a breach, it's a bit too late, and you can provide it, you can bring an outside provider and they can help you contain and do all the forensic analysis. But we need to spend a little more time in the middle, understanding during a breach what we're doing and how we're mitigating those types of things. And this is where having good digital forensics and incident response people working together with your team can bridge that gap. So let's talk a little bit about process, because as Doug mentioned in his presentation, I think the important distinction we're seeing in the market is between what I call the old way of doing security, which is let's look at it from a technology perspective. Let's buy the latest and greatest technology. Let's implement it. Let's protect as much as we can, to the new way, which is let's understand the loss events. Let's understand how the attacker would implement that, and let's optimize our security so that we can design something that gives us higher risk reduction at lower cost. To do that, there's several inputs you need in your security framework. We look at it like this. We have a threat intelligence driven approach, which is keeping an ear to the ground and looking at the darknet forums and understanding what types of attacks and new capabilities are being developed, or maybe whether you're being targeted, that type of intelligence, so you can be somewhat proactive. This is later coming out in your MITRE analysis. You're seeing MITRE come up with constantly publishing new techniques. These techniques would be at operating system levels, but more and more you're seeing different types of threats, OT, IoT. So you're going to see this these types of MITRE techniques expanding vastly, in my view. And then you're seeing also your SOC operation team giving you a lot of inputs. How can we do this faster? What can we automate? How can we optimize our playbooks? But maybe if I can, we're seeing a huge advantage around what can I do to maybe enrich my information as it comes in, so that I don't need an analyst to look at it anymore. I can remove false positives and get better signal. So and of course, the key aspect here though is working with the customer, and the customer, they know their systems, they know where their confidential data is, they know what the loss events are. How do we now combine that with this scenario-driven approach to understand what we can do a little better and a little different to protect them and reduce their risk? One of the things I've found out from working in this industry is that there's a big difference between doing it the way everybody else does and doing it a little bit uniquely, because hackers, once they understand what technology you're running, what security tools, it gives them a really nice roadmap for understanding where the gaps are and penetrating your environment. Just doing a few things differently, writing a little bit of customization in those detection rules, pulling data from other sources can vastly change your security profile. So what we do is we have an approach we call a use case factory. You can submit your scenario from these various sources. It's an agile approach, but it's a factory approach because some of the newer tools, you heard Ann Johnson earlier, Microsoft Sentinel isn't a configuration environment. You need to program KQL and build your detection rules. We need to build automations, and those automations and playbooks might require integrations to be developed to third-party tools. But it's an iterative process of continuous definition and refinement, which, back to Doug's point, gives you the ability to measure not just how we are, do we have enough people to triage all the alerts? How are we improving our detection capability and improving our response time? And these become the KPIs. What we've also done is work across multiple clients to reverse engineer these back into a catalog so that we can get reuse across different clients. So as we develop these ideas and these newer ways of reducing risk for customers, we can then package these up and use them across other customers. And then we roll that into a combined SOC. Many cases, this is where your hybrid approach comes in, and then we tie it into security teams. So we see probably the biggest advantage coming into this factory approach of really adapting the way we look at the defenses, customizing it a bit, being cutting edge, and then trying to measure that in terms of improvement. The main metric we're looking at is how have we reduced risk against a certain loss event for our customers. Finally, let's look at it from a technology standpoint, because one of the key challenges, and when you take a look at the problems that were stated, how do we become more agile? How do we respond and optimize this? One of the key shifts you're seeing in the market, it's not this, everybody needs a SIM, but it's not the SIM that becomes the center of the world anymore. It's your response platforms. How do we respond? How do How do we take the inputs? As you're getting more advanced firewalls, you're getting more advanced applications, you're going to have alerts coming from different locations. One of the key examples is we see many customers as they move from your on-premise data center environments where you're running something like ArcSight or QRadar to cloud. You might find that it's better to run something like Azure Sentinel in the cloud, but then correlate the inputs from your on-prem environment with the inputs coming from Azure Sentinel. Maybe those are coming from Office 365. So the key aspect is to do correlation of the alerts, to be able to tie those into playbooks and orchestrate that for faster response. One of the other key things that we found in these environments as you're moving particularly from on-prem into cloud is that you've made a lot of investments in technology and we need to reuse those investments. And one of the key problems in many organizations is how do I collect all this information? How do we collect the information from the logs? How do we tag it appropriately so that we can correlate it effectively? And then aggregate maybe these inputs and correlations from multiple SIMs, orchestrate that, and then moving off to the left, how do we then reduce the time to respond to these attacks? And part of the challenge of keying these metrics from, as we talked earlier, from creating a language that goes from the SOC operation up to the board level is turning all these various input sources and alerts into an understanding of how, what we've done from a detection and response capability and being able to measure that back into how we've reduced the risk for our customers. So the technology architecture, the flexibility in it become absolutely key to getting that question answered. So to kind of summarize, and we'll take questions, and relating this back to what Doug talked about earlier, we're seeing that the key things that we feel our customers are asking us for as far as an MSSP is this hybrid model. And the hybrid model is not one of those things you can just say, hey, I'm hybrid and start doing. You need to think through how you're going to interact with your customer. So what we did is we developed what we call the CyberProof Defense Center to be able to enable us to aggregate a lot of that information, put it into a model to collaborate with our customer, but then also to provide that transparency by looking at the data and information coming through that. In addition, part of that hybrid model you see on the right is a bot we call SIMO, who's a virtual agent that is picking up more and more of the activities through automation, but also machine learning and other types of activities so that SIMO can get smarter over time and understand the environment and then take the workload off the analyst. The second is really helping customers become more digital. And those customers that are interested in better security are those typically going through digital transformations. They're the ones that are going, this is showing up as moving from on-premise into cloud, which gives them a very distributed environment. So how do we help them by pulling this information together, looking across it, building better response and detection and response capabilities by aggregating information across these environments? The third is, and probably one of the most important, is how do we become more agile? How do we look at security from both perspectives? How do we understand the operations and what's going on? But also from the perspective of how do we not become a bottleneck when it comes to these digital technologies? How do we make sure that we're putting the right prevention technologies in, being able to instrument it so we're getting the right data off of them, but look at it holistically in a way that reduces risk faster. The fourth point is really around MITRE. There's a number of frameworks, most of them are control-based, but if you flip them around, you'll see that MITRE can also be looked at as a control base, but gives you granularity to understand the different techniques attackers would use. And if you use it to give you an idea of how well you're covered, it can enable you to create a language to communicate value back up to the board and back down to your security operations team, as well as your team building security architectures for the future. And then finally, Doug mentioned outcome. I'll let Doug give his points on this slide as well. But when we talk about risk outcomes, how do we develop a security architecture that enables us to bring in new technologies, but also how do we measure that in terms of overall risk reduction? So there's always a cost benefit, there's always a focus, and how do we enable ourselves to look at it more from a business perspective so that we know we're spending the money in the right place, but also spending enough to reduce our risk to a certain level. Anyway, I spoke a lot, Doug. Let me hand it over to you because I know hopefully this reflects part of what you said earlier, but love to get your points on this as well. Are you up there? You may be muted now. I think we have an over-aggressive muting button. There you go. I think I heard you.
There we go. How about that?
That's perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. So Tony, I would echo, your statements. Again, from a market perspective, the key things that we're seeing, lack of talent, static agreements just simply don't work in the security space. And the two keys for me are you need agility and flexibility, right? To help with digital transformation, but more importantly, to keep up with or hopefully in front of, adversaries. And then the hybrid model we think is the more attractive option out in the market today, because of staffing concerns and also to avoid that rip and replace of some significant investment that has gone into the security organizations over the last 2 to 3 years. So I think I would summarize it that way.
Perfect. So I think we have about 15 minutes. We did get a couple of questions from the audience. Let me see. So I think this one's probably more addressed from you. We've got what size organizations should consider outsourced services? Can you give some guidelines?
Yeah, so we see everything in the market from very small, couple $100 million a year kind of organizations, all the way up to Fortune 5. So I don't think you can actually limit it based on the size of an organization. I think you need to look at what kind of data assets do they have, what's their threat posture, et cetera, and then make a decision. I think the very interesting thing about a hybrid model is it supports the full spectrum, right? You can start small, and as a business grows, right, it will scale. And some of the other models that are out in the marketplace today don't necessarily lend themselves to supporting, smaller footprints.
The next question is, how should organizations approach the question of in-house security training if they are working with outsourced service providers who are not local? Is that something the MSSP would be involved with?
Typically, we see that sort of split, right? A lot of clients that have, really robust learning management and training organizations in-house tend to do a lot of that work themselves. However, our view is, we're advocates for bringing in MSSPs to at least help develop the content. Excuse me. I also believe that there are different types of training activities that go on. To me, a phishing campaign is a training exercise. We don't believe that you should be running those in-house. We think MSSPs are set up to do those quickly. They're very efficient, usually much lower cost than trying to do it in-house. Right. So I think it depends on strategically what kind of training you're looking to do and how often you're going to do it as well.
So you mentioned future-proofing, or we mentioned future-proofing. I think, isn't it harder to plan for the future when you're dealing with an external provider? The number of people involved is greater, so the process might be more complex.
I don't agree that it's more difficult using an external provider. In fact, I would probably argue the other side of that. I think you're more likely to future-proof and move more quickly with a partner or partners, maybe more than one, in a hybrid delivery model. If for no other reason, then MSSPs are on the front lines every day across industries with multiple customers, and they can really see what's happening across the market, right? Whereas if you're trying to do this all internally, you tend to have a very industry specific view, and it's generally limited to your own experiences. Right, so I'm a big advocate in expanding and bringing in partners for those type of activities.
Great. I would agree with you on that too. We see, we didn't mention it before, but I know we work with academia as well to look at what the cutting edge is. And many of our clients use some of our agreements. One we did with you, for example, has an innovation investment fund that we co-invest in to look at and try out new technologies across the different customers. So the
Sorry, I'd just like to add to that. We see that as an ask now. Most of our larger clients, at least, are asking for those innovation funding approaches to help ensure they have a way to keep up and move forward, right? And I think that's a change in the security space, especially. We would see innovation funds at an overall deal perspective, but we're starting to see those be very specifically tied to security and advancing capability and maturity in that space.
Yeah, that's a good point. I have another question here. Does having a hybrid model open up an organization to certain types of risk? Company information is being saved and discussed by a second organization. Is that inherently problematic in your view?
I would hope not. Right. If the right security controls are in place, your partner should only be able to get to the data they need to do the work you've contracted them for. We have seen a few examples. There was a provider that had an incident last year or earlier this year, where some of those controls weren't in place, and there were some minor impacts. But from a general perspective, I would not see that as a barrier to sourcing in any way.
It's interesting too. I think because we are a security company and we depend on our reputation is kind of like cloud companies, right? If Amazon had one breach in the cloud, it was due to them, then their entire business model is at risk. So we have to look at our business the same way. We have to be actually better than our clients in many of these cases to be able to operate.
Yeah.
One other question: what type of reporting mechanisms are key to making a hybrid SOC work? I'll get your take. I probably have one here as well, but
yeah, that's kind of a loaded question. I think from my perspective, the days of old, I need this report every day at 8 a.m. are gone, right? Most of our clients today are looking for summary level dashboards that you can drill through to get to underlying data when you need it. And most importantly, it cannot be static, right? We've talked a lot about agile and flexibility in this conversation today. That to me is the key attribute that whatever kind of system you're putting in place needs to have. It needs to be able to rapidly evolve, because this industry and the security space in particular is evolving at just a staggering pace. I mean, if you look at what happened in the past 8 or 9 months, clients and industries had to change the way they delivered services because their people couldn't come into the office. That was a massive disruptor in the security space. If you go back 5 years, if we had been operating with that kind of technology, I don't think the industry would be where it is, and I'm not sure some companies would have survived.
Yeah, I agree 100%. In fact, I'll answer it the same way. What we're seeing from our clients really kind of goes back to that use case factory as well, right? So we've always had SLAs, and those SLAs say how fast do we respond, and those are what people typically request. But what we're finding is to make that work, it's more of a real time. How did we respond to this incident? How did we respond to this incident? How did we improve our response, and what did we learn from that? How did we reduce the number of gaps in our detection framework, and how did we align that back to the attack scenarios? So they become more setting common goals and targets. So these aren't necessarily the responsibility of the provider alone. They're the responsibility of the customer and the provider together. And that enables us to bring, create some common goals and bring behaviors together, right? So.
Yeah, I agree. I think the thing that, you and I have talked about it, and most of the people on the call hopefully picked up on it earlier. These are board level conversations now, right? And having older reporting mechanisms and lack of agility are not likely to resonate well with the board if you do have an event, right? Being able to show that you quickly identified it and took action, and minimized loss is really what the boards are interested in these days, right?
Yes, absolutely. So, and in fact, I got a question here at Hawk is trying to do boards really prescribe to the knowledge that prevention's better. What's a prevention quote? But prevention, what's a quote? Prevention better than the cure. I think they got it wrong, but are they willing to what is your perspective on how you're seeing these agreements, and what's the how are boards looking at at cybersecurity, particularly the more progressive companies today?
Most of the boards that we deal with are very much in tune with cybersecurity as a top concern. They're willing to free up funding to advance the maturity level of the organization. They're very focused on, reducing loss events, particularly around, PII, GDPR, the new California legislation, and data loss, and things that could cause reputational damage. We see a lot of companies that 3 or 4 years ago couldn't get funding for just basic initiatives to build that foundational capability. That's changing rapidly. We don't really run into that. We're seeing more large-scale transformation initiatives in the security space, sometimes as part of a digital transformation, other times, on its own. And generally, if it's bundled in a larger transformation, they're transforming other parts of the business to either A, get more product to market faster, or B, free up dollars, to allow them to do that, as well as, increase their security maturity. So it's definitely a board conversation. We don't see a lot of pushback. You do get questions on spending naturally, but probably not the same level of questions you would expect. That's what we're seeing. I don't know, Tony, you deal with a lot of board of director conversations as well. What do you see?
Yeah, it's interesting. I wanted to actually tie this into my next question for you, but what we're seeing a very interesting impact from COVID and the pandemic on the board conversations as well. So we had been analyzing board conversations, and it was probably related to the latest attack, as I mentioned earlier. But as you mentioned, when we hit the pandemic and everybody went and worked offsite, there are specific business problems that arise. I can't do my operations because my processing center in the Philippines, follows a lot of controls that I can't do, and these people are working from home, right? I have my things in, so the problems change very quickly. And but what that's done is, I think, opened up the need to be more agile and to be more business focused around security. So we're seeing the conversations being board driven now as opposed to the other way around. I think it's showing up in RFP. So what we just found is probably Q4, everybody's waking back up and say, all right, I kind of went on hold for a bit, but now we got to really focus on security. And we're seeing many of these conversations being a little more business focused than we did before the pandemic. So now I only have a small, but go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, Tony, we see the same thing. The other thing that we saw a lot of, early in Q3 is, okay, we had to respond rapidly. So we did some things and broke our security architecture and controls. How do we fix it? Right. And so we saw a lot of activity around that. A lot of that noise is kind of dying down. People have done a lot of remediation work, but we're seeing the same thing. I think a lot of businesses have realized there's no need to go back to the way they operated before, right? A lot of organizations in certain industries have seen productivity increase rather than decrease because of this new model. It's going to be around for a while. And so boards and, C-level conversations are now around, if this is really the future of the company, right, what do we need to do to secure it? And so I think we're seeing exactly what you are. Definitely a lot of activities in Q4, and we expect that to continue into next year.
Yeah, I'd almost say that security became it went from a back office function to a we must our brand must include security. We've seen it in financial services companies for a while, right? Security is part of the brand, but now we're starting to see it in other types of industries where security becomes a bit of a front part of the brand as opposed to a back office. So,
yeah, I agree. We're seeing the same thing. Healthcare and CPG companies are definitely in that same boat as financial services now. The other thing I've seen is, I'll call it the rise of the CISO. It's no longer a function reporting into the CIO. It now is either CEO or maybe COO kind of reporting structure. People are breaking it out of IT, which is a significant shift.
Yeah, and now hopefully they'll keep their jobs a little longer. What do they call it? Career is suddenly over. CISO. So, but
yeah, that's fine, Tony. I met a CISO last week who's been in a role for 10 years.
That's amazing. That's great. We are seeing, I know for a fact, many CISOs after breaches are keeping their jobs and other people are losing their jobs. So it's an interesting world. It's changing very quickly. Anyway, I think we've run out of all the questions, and I think we've also run out of time. So I don't know if we're going to do another poll, but this, Doug, I really appreciate your time on this, and let's keep in touch. We have a lot more helping clients to do as we go forward. So,
absolutely. Thanks for having me.